Dipa Ma, Chapter 10, Fearless Daughter of the Buddha. Quote, I can do anything a man can do. Even as a widowed single mother, trying to undertake her spiritual path within the confines of a patriarchal and hierarchical Buddhist monastic system, Dipa Ma never doubted that she could reach the highest goal. At that time and place, there was no such thing as a women's liberation movement. Dipa Ma simply liberated herself. She once remarked, I have no fear. I am at peace now. Before Dipa Ma began meditation practice, she was known to be anxious and dependent on others. Given her personal and cultural background, marriage at age 12, confinement to her in-laws' house, subordination to her husband, it is astonishing that she became such a free thinker. She insisted, for example, that her daughter Dipa get a university education, and later was supportive when Dipa decided to leave her marriage. Dipa Ma acknowledged the difficulties of the women around her, but insisted that they too could walk the path to liberation. When you are born in this world, she told her student Primotoi Barua, you have to face many sufferings, especially if you are a woman. A woman's life is very difficult. But you need not worry about this. You must maintain your practice. You must not worry that you have to take care of your husband and children. If you are in the Dharma, everything will happen through it. Everything will be solved through the Dharma. End quote. In addition to spiritual counsel, Dipa Ma often gave practical advice to the women who sought her out. She would lecture me, recalls one Calcutta housewife. You should not think that women are helpless. You are not helpless. First of all, you should get an education, and secondly, you should do service. If you take care of your economic condition, then you will be independent. End quote. Mostly, though, Dipa Ma gave strength to others by her own example. She was a master teacher in an almost exclusively male monastic lineage, and one of the first female Asian masters to be invited to teach in America. Dipa Ma never made much of those accomplishments, but her powerful example offers inspiration and encouragement to women of every culture. Challenging Tradition by Jack Engler. Quote, one day we were all sitting on the floor of Ma's room. It was very crowded and very hot. Munindra was sitting on a chair in the corner talking to Ma's students about the Dharma and their practice. He and I were the only men in the room. While he talked, Ma was sitting on her wooden bed, leaning back against the wall with her eyes closed. It looked like she had dozed off. She hadn't been well, and no one took any notice. The conversation was about rebirth. Somehow it got onto the rebirths of the Buddha. Obviously not thinking much about it, since it was part of the tradition, Munindra happened to mention that only men could become Buddhas. To become a Buddha, you had to have taken rebirth in a male body, according to later commentaries, not original texts. Suddenly Ma bolted upright, eyes wide open, and said in a tone of spontaneous and utter conviction, I can do anything a man can do. Our reaction was equally spontaneous. We all laughed, Munindra included. I think we all knew it was absolutely true. End quote. Emotions Are Not a Hindrance by Michelle Levy. Quote, when she mentioned that women could go deeper and more quickly into the practice than men because our minds are softer, that surprised me. That softness brings more emotion, more movement in the mind. A lot of women think that the emotions are a hindrance, but Dipa Ma said, women's tendency to be more emotional is not a hindrance to practice. She advised us, just watch the emotions and don't identify. Increase the mindfulness of noticing and the concentration. End quote. Gentleness and Power by Kate Wheeler. She was a combination of gentleness, no pretense, and power. The fact that she was a woman with so much depth and so much authority was a big deal. Nothing about her was what you would associate with someone who was going to lead you. She was not 6 feet tall and wearing a suit. She was a skinny, tiny thing. But she was incredibly thrilling because she did it. She went so far beyond anything. This meant that I might be able to do it too. End quote. A Lighthouse by Michelle McDonald. Quote, at the time I met her, there were mostly male role models, male teachers, male Buddhas. To meet a woman householder who lived with her daughter and grandson, and who is that enlightened, was more profound than I can ever put into words. She embodied what I deeply wanted to be like. Although I was already quite committed to the practice when I met her, she made freedom seem attainable. She simply did it. It was not some intellectual idea. For me to be a woman householder, and to see her as a woman householder, I immediately felt, if she can do this, I can too. She is like a lighthouse, a light I have oriented to when I have needed the courage to continue to walk the path. End quote. Enough, by Ajahn Thanasanti. Quote, coming from California, my personal image of a powerful woman was an Amazon who jumps in the back of a pickup truck with a chainsaw and is going to sort out the world. But the power of Dipa Ma was the power of touching the heart. I felt completely known by her, and yet I didn't need to hide or to be ashamed, because I felt both totally known and totally loved at the same time. I remember writing a letter home to my friends after experiencing that kind of love, telling them that if my journey had ended at that point, it would have been good enough. Just having made contact with that profound love was enough. End quote. There's Hope for Men, by Joseph Goldstein. Quote, Dipa Ma once said, women have an advantage over men because they have more supple minds. It may be difficult for men to understand this because they are men. I asked her, is there any hope for us? She answered, the Buddha was a man and Jesus was a man, so there is hope for men too. End quote. Research with Dipa Ma and Calcutta Housewives, by Jack Engler. Beginning of quote. After a year of intensive meditation practice with Munindra, I approached him about beginning my doctoral research on the process and outcomes of insight meditation practice. Part of this was an attempt to validate classic and contemporary accounts of the changes that were reported to take place following enlightenment. Finding subjects was no easy task, because it required identifying practitioners who had experienced at least, quote, first path, or first stage of enlightenment, and gaining their cooperation. To a traditional Indian teacher, this was an extremely unorthodox request, and Munindra was hesitant. After many discussions, he finally agreed to take me to Calcutta and introduce me to some of his most advanced students. Key among these was Dipa Ma, who was initially skeptical. Eventually, however, she introduced me to a number of her students, and volunteered herself and her daughter Dipa as well. Munindra himself agreed to participate. For the research, Ma provided all women in their middle age and older. It needs to be borne in mind that it is not customary for women to go out alone in India. These women belonged, with one exception, to the older culture, and most of them were extremely busy with the many responsibilities of running and maintaining a large joint Indian family. The testimony I heard was universal that women make better meditators. I could never quite get to the bottom of this. I asked Ma about it, particularly whether it meant that women tended to go further in the practice than men. I had been told this by several Sayadaws in Burma and by some Indian teachers. Ma simply said that she had just as many men who had attained the path as women, but they were not available during the daytime when I would be interviewing and testing. For more than 6 months in 1977, Dipa Ma's small room became a research center for the systematic interviewing and psychological testing of advanced Buddhist practitioners. Most of the interviewing was done during the hot season. If you've lived through the steamy and suffocating, often searing heat of a tropical hot season, you can imagine the conditions in a city like Calcutta, and the effect of that climate on human and environmental resources. Electric power was invariably shut off during the hottest hours of the afternoon and evening, Calcutta's infamous brownouts, to conserve generator supplies in the city. If we were able to begin at all, and the heat sometimes made it physically impossible, we often ended in darkness, soaked through with perspiration. If there was transportation to the old city in the morning, it was often doubtful whether there would be transportation out of it again at night. After the monsoon arrived, I'd sometimes get to her neighborhood and be unable to get through. The entire street in front of her house would be flooded up to knee or even thigh level, and I would have to take a rickshaw the last few blocks, riding just above the water. Yet somehow Ma's women students would always be there ahead of me. Ma's test protocols, especially her responses to the Rorschach, were the most remarkable ever seen by any of the investigators. The Rorschach test, which measures not only personality but perception, has been described as reflecting, quote, self-created reality. In Diploma's case, the Rorschach results seemed to confirm that she had undergone a profound cognitive emotional restructuring and psychic integration associated with the deepest levels of enlightenment. Among other things, she spontaneously and effortlessly wove each consecutive response across the entire range of cards into an ongoing narrative that revealed the whole of the teaching of the Dharma, all without once violating good form perception on each card. A remarkable achievement none of the researchers had ever witnessed. Reported in Mindfulness Meditation 2, in Transformations of Consciousness, Ken Wilber, Jack Engler, and Daniel Brown, Boston, Shambhala, 1986. Mountain of Serenity by Catherine Ingram. Quote, what I remember most about Dipa Ma was the total stillness and unmoving sense of quiet about her. In the winter of 1976-77, my friend Alan Clements and I were spending some time in Calcutta with Munindra and Dipa Ma. One day, Munindra invited us to attend a lecture he was giving that night. We rode over with Munindra and Dipa Ma and arrived very early. Alan, Dipa Ma, and I settled into the front row. Gradually, the room began to fill up. 20 minutes later, there were about 200 people jammed in a room we would not have put more than 50 in. My legs were sort of on top of Dipa Ma's. I was practically on her lap. Then Munindra proceeded to give a 5-hour lecture in Bengali. So here we were in a stifling hot, overcrowded room, listening for 5 hours in Bengali. It took everything I had to stay put, and I felt as if there were Mexican jumping beans in my body. I was squirming, fidgeting, and sighing. But Dipa Ma was a mountain of serenity. She was in some kind of deep concentration for those 5 hours. And in my agitation, I kept coming back to her silence and stillness, and it would calm me. That was what got me through. She didn't even seem to notice my struggling. There was no judgment, just a radiating sense of ease and calm. Fearless Daughters of the Buddha by Maria Monroe. Quote, Dipa Ma and I were on an airplane coming to the States from India. It was very, very turbulent, and at one point the plane hit an air pocket and dropped. Drinks and other objects flew up to the ceiling as the plane dropped downward before hitting stable air again. I kind of screamed. Dipa Ma was sitting across the aisle from me, and she reached out and took my hand, and she just held it. Then she whispered, "The daughters of the Buddha are fearless." End section.